We talked elsewhere about how corporations are doing on claims of sustainability, reducing emissions, and so on. And we looked at even carbon capture and sequestration and whether they are succeeding and so on. And there is always this need to monitor the claims made by corporations. Are they really separate from us? Of course not, because I'm sure my retirement fund is invested in all kinds of corporations, some of which are listed here as being high in their scrupulous monitoring of their own targets versus just going after profits. The good example is always the Volkswagen, which comes from Germany, one of the most progressive countries on climate action. Yet Germany itself will probably burn coal this year in 2022 winter because Russian oil supply has been hampered. Plus Volkswagen cheated on emissions, which is really egregious, and there were some deaths attributable to this cheating on emissions, and Toyota is found to have been playing a role to scuttle the efforts to advance EVs because they invested on hydrogen cell as a technology for the future and so on. So this group, New Climate, looks at it's also called Carbon Market Watch. They have several aspects they look at. So this is Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor 2022, assessing the transparency and integrity of companies' emissions reduction and net zero targets. So to make sure that companies are not just doing a greenwash, to put green labels on everything and portray themselves as good guys while continuing to do things that are not so nice for climate and the planet. As I said, people who make profits or have stocks of corporations also have to worry about it, not just the companies. We assess, so this report basically focuses on a few things. We assess and draw insights on transparency and integrity in four main reasons of corporate climate action: tracking and disclosure of emissions, setting emission reductions targets, reducing own emissions, climate contributions, and offsetting claims. You know what offsetting is, where if you're emitting a certain amount of greenhouse gases, then you pay a third party to plant trees for you or do other climate actions which sequester carbon that is equivalent to the amount you are emitting. So it's kind of an offset. There is arguments about that's a good idea or bad idea, and honestly there is not enough land to plant trees if everybody started to use offsets. We have discussed this elsewhere as well. So the report looked at 25 companies in this report for major multinational companies here, in fact. They reported combined revenues of US $3.18 trillion in 2020, approximately 10% of the total revenue from the world's largest 500 companies. Their total self-reported greenhouse gas emissions footprint in 2019, including upstream and downstream emissions, so that's scope 1, 2, and 3, that may include a moderate level of overlap, amount to approximately 2.7 gigaton CO2 equivalent. These are self-reported. This is equivalent to roughly 5% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So with emissions, we look at scope 1, 2, and 3, where you have emissions from your source materials, your production processes, and so on. Then you are also selling things like, let's say you're producing cars and they are being transported by someone else to the place where they are sold. So there are downstream emissions, so upstream emissions scope 1 and 2, and downstream emissions scope 3. And who should be responsible for scope 3? If it's part of your business, then obviously you should account for that as well, and that doesn't always happen. So just to jump to the key insights from the report, and then we'll look at some figures. Headline pages are often ambiguous and emission reduction commitments are limited. This is not unexpected because the main goal is to satisfy the customers, the stakeholders, the governments, and have a good image. Net zero targets commit to reduce the analyzed companies' aggregate emissions by only 40% on average, not not 100% as suggested by the term net zero. So offsets may be used for other parts, for example. All of the 25 companies assessed in this report pledged some form of zero emissions, net zero or carbon neutrality target, but just 3 of the 25 companies, Maersk, Vodafone and Deutsche Telekom, clearly commit to deep decarbonization of over 90% of their full value chain emissions, including Scope 3, by their respective target years of their headline pledges. At least 5 of the companies only commit to reduce their emissions by less than 15%, often by excluding upstream and downstream emissions. So there is some bookkeeping voodoo done to make announced pledges. The 13 companies that provide specific details on what their headline net zero pledges mean commit to reduce their full value chain emissions from 2019 by only 40% on average. The other 12 companies do not accompany their headline pledges with any specific emission reduction commitment for their target year. Collectively, the 25 companies specifically commit to reducing only less than 20% of their 2.7 gigaton CO2 equivalent emission footprint, which is again self-proclaimed, they're self-reported, by their respective headline target years. Okay, so the second key finding here is that targets for 2030 fall well short of the ambition required to align with the internationally agreed goals of the Paris Agreement and avoid the most damaging effects of climate change. So Paris Agreement agrees to keeping the global warming by 2100 well below 2 degrees centigrade with a probability of about 67%, and also aim for staying below 1.5 degrees C if possible. So there are various caveats there. So whatever pledges you make, your emissions reductions pathways by 2030 have to be on track to meet those drawdown requirements to hit the global warming targets. Among the companies we assessed, 15 of the 25 prominently report interim climate targets. However, our analysis finds that the average emission reduction commitment of full value chain emissions between 2019 and 2030 is just 23%, if we exclude the 5 companies for which we could not identify any commitment for emissions reductions post-2019. This compares to the need to cut global greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 50% between 2010 and 2030. We are way behind already, equivalent to approximately half of 2019 emissions levels, to be in line with the goal to limit global warming temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C. Pretty much clear that we'll blow past 1.5 degrees C, and as I've commented elsewhere, these are not entirely scientific targets. These are kind of guardrail policies, 2 degrees C on 1.5 degrees C. It's not entirely clear how many additional bad things will happen compared to what's already happening, for example, in terms of floods, droughts, wildfires, health impacts, hurricanes, cyclones, sea level rise, and so on. Keeping that in mind, we are looking here at integrity of corporate net zero pledges, and these are the gradings given by the assessment newclimate.org. So what they appear to pledge, what they really commit to by net zero target year, what is left out and what is unclear. So here we are, 2.7 gigaton CO2 equivalent in 2019, combined greenhouse gas emissions footprint of 25 companies with net zero targets already pledged with target dates, including scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. Target years range from 2025, which is right here, to 2050, which is out there. So they hope to bring it down to zero. What they really commit to is only about 0.5 gigaton CO2 emissions reduction, CO2 equivalent. So methane and nitrous oxide HFCs are converted to CO2 equivalent using greenhouse warming potential, residence time, and concentrations. Okay, so additionally here you have 0.1 gigaton CO2 equivalent in terms of offsetting plants, which are not completely solid, especially if you run out of space to plant trees, for example, by then. And then you have additional 1.35 gigaton CO2 equivalent in terms of emissions that companies could control through their value chains, but exclude from their net zero target. Could be scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions they could manage. What remains unclear is zero 0.7 gigaton CO2 equivalent, emissions under ambiguous net zero targets with no specific emission reduction commitment. So we have to watch out for corporate lingo, which sounds very bold and promising, but constant monitoring, reporting, and evaluation or verification are needed. Certifications from standard setting initiatives the report offers. Number of companies here. So here also we were looking at CDP certification or assessment of transparency. So this is climate disclosure plan. Science-based target certification and overall assessment of overall integrity, so integrity of companies' climate strategies. So you can see that there are a bunch of companies that are less than so 5 companies here which are getting grade of B or worse. There are some that get A minus and there are some that get A, and the assessment of transparency by this group is very low, low, moderate, and reasonable for these number of companies here. Science-based targets pending for almost 8 companies out of these. 2 degree C compatible, there are a few companies, and 1.5 degree C compatible up here. And we'll look at the integrity of companies in a table as well. And this is the overall integrity assessment. Almost half of them have very low integrity score. Some of them have low integrity score, some moderate, and only I think maybe 1 or 2 have a reasonable integrity score. Nobody has high integrity score. Okay, so use of offsets for carbon neutrality claims and net zero pledges, responsibility for unabated emissions today, and plans for achieving pledges in the future. So again, about 6 companies here in responsibility for unabated emissions. So this is the color scheme here. Offsetting emissions to claim carbon neutrality, offsets with insufficient permanence. So nature-based solutions like restoring wetlands or planting trees, they are not permanent carbon sequestrations. Okay, they are temporary. The orangish color here corresponds to offsetting emissions to claim carbon neutrality, so other forms of offsets. Offsetting emissions to claim carbon neutrality, no published details on the type of offset, so they are here in plans for the future, and uncertain about potential offsetting plans in this gray here. Climate contributions without a neutralization claim, so almost 4 or 5 companies here, and not assuming responsibility for unabated emissions, almost half of the companies. So overall, it's not great news in terms of use of offsets for carbon neutrality claims and net zero pledges. Even though offset is a way of saying we'll take care of it, don't worry, and delaying things or relying on the third party to say, for example, if you pay China to plant trees for you, there is somebody who's auditing for additional carbon sequestered by those planted trees, which already is not a permanent sequestration. So there's all kinds of details that are missing. Looking at overview of good practice for corporate climate responsibility, I won't go into the details, but here tracking and disclosing emissions and good practice and good practice performance in terms of transparency and integrity. So you can see that comprehensive disclosure, there is fairly low score in terms of overall transparency and integrity, only 6 out of 25. In terms of setting specific and substantiated targets, which includes coverage of emission sources, emission reductions in the pledge, and interim targets by 2030, let's say. The scores are like this. So in terms of coverage of emissions resources, there is reasonable coverage for 19 of the 25. In terms of transparency and in terms of integrity, it's reasonable score for 15 out of 25. Emissions reductions in the pledge itself is very low, only 1 out of 25 in terms of transparency in emissions reductions pledges, and very low in terms of integrity as well, with only 3 out of 25 doing well in pledges of emissions reductions. For example, this includes setting specific emission reduction target that is independent from any offsetting and aligned with 1.5 degree compatible trajectories or benchmarks for the sector as their main headline pledge. Okay, so all these details matter here as well. In terms of interim targets, reasonable, 15 out of 25, but integrity is very low. So the goal is not to scream at companies. As I said, I don't really consider them as separate entities. The entire socioeconomic system is tied up with their stocks, profits, and greed, if we can use that word. So reducing emissions, again, emissions reduction measures and renewable electricity generation and procurement, no good news there, low or very low. In terms of climate contributions and offsetting climate contributions, offsetting claims today, offsetting claims today here. In terms of avoid misleading claims, avoid misleading pledges. Transparency and integrity, again, very low across the board for all these criteria used. So we can then look at overview of companies assessed in Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor 2022 in terms of high integrity, reasonable integrity, moderate and low integrity pledges here, transparency, integrity, and where the report is in the page in terms of page numbers. I won't read the whole list, but there is a list of companies among 25 which fall in very low integrity as well. So reasonable integrity, Maersk net zero by 2040 has reasonable scores in terms of transparency and integrity. Moderate integrity, Apple, Sony, Vodafone, so carbon neutral by 2030, 2040, 2050 and 2040 here. Again, transparency and integrity, you can see the scores there in terms of pie charts. And our great friend Amazon, Deutsche Telekom, and I also again want to point out Google, IKEA, Volkswagen, which I mentioned before. Various targets, but scores are low in terms of integrity when combined transparency and integrity are considered. So this is for some of my friends who are obsessed with success stories of billionaires and companies and pledges of companies, and Al Gore said there is a revolution, a tipping point has arrived, game changer has arrived in terms of corporate practices and so on, and yet these things have to be kept in mind in terms of pledges versus practices, transparency and integrity in terms of committed actions on what the pledges are. Okay?